Hey there, podcast listeners. This is Corbett Lunsford, your host. This special episode of the Building Performance Podcast is from last year's Fall Fast Track, which is my annual 6-week mastermind course with people all over the world, all about profiting from home performance. If you'd like to learn more and pre-register for free, you can do that at homeperformance.training. Enjoy.
A rising tide lifts all boats. Fall Fast Track.
Today we're talking with Jeff Leiker, who is a professor of industrial and operations engineering at University of Michigan. He's also the principal of Leiker Lean Advisors, and you might know him as the author of The Toyota Way. Jeff Leiker, thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Thanks, Corbett, for having me.
Jeff, so you are an expert in lean manufacturing and just leanness in general, which I take to be quality control. Is that how you would describe what you do?
I would put it more broadly than quality control. But in fact, the way many people think about lean is in terms of efficiency, doing more with less, eliminating waste that prevents you from efficiently carrying out your task. And they think of the quality movement and quality control as kind of a separate issue. I think over time we've broadened people's perspective about what lean is. And for me, I started really learning about it from Toyota, and I define it in terms of the Toyota Way, which is really how do you achieve cost, quality, delivery, safety, and morale. That is how do you achieve for the customer the best possible product or service at a low cost that is high value and with reliability and with the quality that the customer, that's actually beyond what the customer expects. And how do you do that in such a way that you're also taking care of your people and their morale is high and they're treated fairly and they're safe? So it's all those things: cost, quality, safety, and morale. And the particular outcome, the particular, say, objective that you're measuring doesn't change the process for achieving that objective. The process of what we call lean, or some would call it continuous improvement. The process of continuous improvement is the same whether you're trying to achieve safety or quality or productivity or cost reduction.
Interesting. Okay, so in the construction industry, whether it's commercial or residential, what we generally look at when we start to go after a higher performance is some kind of a certification scheme, which involves some checklists on making sure that you did things and then getting metrics on how much, for example, how much the utility bills are or how airtight it is or how the water tightness layer was managed. So if the metrics and the checklists are filled out, does that meet your goals for leanness in general?
I would say that would be kind of one kind of minimum standard. Like if you want something that's mediocre but not terrible, a checklist can get you to at least being mediocre. But companies, high performance companies, like a company like Toyota, is not satisfied with mediocre performance. They're looking for excellence, and you can't checklist your way to excellence. What you can get people to do is to not mess up in an obvious, horrible way. And part of that has to do with the perspective of standard operating procedures and the perspective on measures. And one of my colleagues, his name is Paul Adler, and he had studied Toyota's joint venture with General Motors 30 years ago. That was called NUMMI. It was a joint venture in California. And he went into NUMMI with the expectation that they have participative management. They involve everybody, including the worker, in improving quality, improving productivity. And he was going and looking for that. So he's expecting a very open environment without rules, without procedures, where people are empowered to do their thing. And he was contrasting that to top-down management system where you manage by edict, by, do this or else you're going to get punished, or if you do this, you'll get rewarded, and we're going to measure you and see if you're doing it. And what he found was that Toyota was very participative, but had measures for everything, and they had standards for everything. So it seemed like a paradox. How could you be high in control and high in employee engagement? So he came up with a new name. He said what Toyota had was actually bureaucracy, which we think of negatively, but they had had a type of bureaucracy that he called enabling bureaucracy, and he contrasted that to coercive bureaucracy, which was more common. In coercive bureaucracy, it's if you do this, you're rewarded. If you do this, you're punished. Follow these rules, and the rules are usually kept by the central office, by a corporate office of some sort, whether it's engineering or quality or safety. And then the police come from the safety department, the quality department, and they check you and they audit you, and you try to pass the audit like you to pass a ISO 9000 audit. And what he found is that you got kind of a minimum baseline of performance by auditing people. They'll do exactly, if you ask me to jump 3 feet, I'll keep on working until I jump 3 feet. When I get to 3 feet, I'm done. I've met your requirement. I'm done. I don't have to put any more effort into it. But you might be able to jump 5 feet if you set as a goal for them to beat a record or try to match an Olympic record, and you motivate them so that they're excited about the idea. And in order to do that, they may have to learn procedures for the right way to jump. And then if they really want to jump high, then they're interested in learning those procedures. And as they're learning them, they might actually come up with some of their own ideas to improve those procedures, which is a good thing. So what he found in Toyota, for example, is that the engineers would come up with, say, standard work, and they would teach that to a work group that included a group leader, team leaders who are hourly employees, and the team members. So the engineer would come up with initial standard work and say, here's how I think this job should be done. Then the group leader and the team members, the team leaders, would do the job, and they would start to find problems. For example, they might find a quality problem. Then they would do problem solving, and they'd find the root cause, and they would say, we really need to build a fixture in here, or we need to build an error-proofing device here. And then they would incorporate that into the standard work. And then they'd report to the engineer, here's how we changed the standard work. So now the work group owned the standard work, and the engineer was really documenting it and learning from it. And as he put it, put what we think of as Frederick Taylor or Taylorism, which is the old scientific management. It turned it on its head. So now the work group had autonomy, but they also had a structure. And the structure of standard work became enabling to them, enabling bureaucracy. It helped them to do their jobs instead of being used as a kind of weapon against them.
That is very deep. So let me make sure that I understand where we're coming from. Do you think that the checklists and metrics are the jumping off point for that? Or do you think you should come from the people angle and try and enable people and then develop the standards later?
I think both. I think it's difficult to develop people or engage people with no structure. You can say to them, I empower you. I'd like you to achieve these goals. You figure out how to do it. In that case, people just struggle because they don't have any framework, or they might, get lucky and they might be able to occasionally give you what you want, but it's not repeatable because they haven't learned any kind of repeatable process. Or you can say, here's standard work. Here's what I want you to do. What we're trying to do is we're trying to improve quality. And what we're going to do is we're going to start out with some quality procedures. And we have some standards from engineering that actually are not debatable. They know that this is how you make a quality car, this is how you make a quality building, this is what quality piping is like. So we have these quality standards, and these are not debatable. But how you carry out your work, there's many ways to carry out your work, and we're going to suggest an initial way. And what we want you to do is we want you to do the work, and then every time you have a problem, we want you to document it. And then we're going to look at the end of every day at what problems you had that day, and then we're going to pick a recurring problem or a problem that has a big impact, and we're going to try to drill down and figure out why that problem occurred and what countermeasures might eliminate that problem. And then we're going to check to see what happens if it actually improves quality or not. And you're going to actually have a metric board where you're going to post that information, and you're going to keep track of quality. And we're going to periodically do audits, and that'll give you some feedback. And we're going to support you with if you have trouble, and if, for example, it's an issue that you can't solve, with the tools that you have, we have some experts who can help you. But you're responsible, Mr. Supervisor, for this level of quality, and you're going to be working with your team. And here's some tools to use, and we'll help you learn to use the tools. And what you'll find is that measurement is actually very powerful. That if I am measuring my own, just like if these devices that you now wear around your wrist or whatever to measure how much you walk in a day and how much exercise you do in a day, people actually can benefit from that. If they learn how to do exercise, if they develop a habit of exercise, if they learn what kinds of foods are good and bad. So they have to learn some things, and then they have a target and a goal, and they have a way of measuring it, and then it becomes engaging, almost like a game.
Interesting. So when we think about, I'm in the construction industry, and I'm thinking about the building of a house or of a building, and I think my first reaction is, that's nothing like a factory. A factory, it's nice and warm, it's well lit. All of the people who work there are employees of the company, but that's not really the way that a car gets built, right? You have tons of subcontractors that create the little individual parts. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's something like 10,000 parts in a car, and about 80% of the car is built outside the factory by subcontractors, so that's a part of it. And then in the factory, depending on the factory, there's many different processes. Some factories, I think every auto factory, at the very least, they weld the car parts together, they paint the car, and then they assemble the car. Toyota, in addition to that, has plastic injection molding, so they injection mold the bumpers, and they also have stamping, so they stamp out the body parts. And then they have an engine plant right nearby that's delivering the engines in sequence just in time. So even in an automotive plant, like the paint process is a chemical process, and in a lot of ways it's not different from painting the house. But when you think about an auto assembly plant, you're not thinking about painting something, you're thinking about putting pieces together. So even the assembly plant is a lot more complicated than most people think. Whether it's bright and whether it's well lit and well heated, that will vary depending on whether the company cares about the employees or not. I've been to many dark and dingy factories that are hot in the summer and cold in the winter. One of the differences is that in most mass production facilities, they are repeating processes very quickly. So in the case of an assembly line, Toyota assembly line, every minute, typically a car is coming off the end of the line. My cycle time for my job before it repeats is 1 minute. There are not a lot of jobs in construction that repeat every minute. So that's a difference. But on the other hand, if you're in a Toyota factory and you're doing maintenance, you see a new problem every time a machine breaks down. So then standard work, for example, has to be much more broad than specifying what you do second by second.
So one of the big problems that we have in multifamily buildings, as an example, where I have been working recently, is that even though they'll have a plan that has been replicated dozens of times, let's say for a retirement community, it's 4 stories, it's got 82 apartments, et cetera, et cetera. We know where all of the services need to run. The map of the electric and the plumbing and the et cetera, are all laid out. Because we've got different people sometimes that'll come in and work on this stuff. We have different inspectors that'll come in. We have a different order of like the schedule of when things get delivered, and change orders are always happening because of material changes, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like every single building, even though it's from the same plan, is a prototype, and we're having to come up with there's new problems on every single building. Is that an unusual problem for lean operations and engineering, or is that a common thing that'll even happen inside of a manufacturing plant?
That's common. Yeah, it's common. So if you go into an average factory that hasn't been seriously at lean for a long time, even if they've had good quality control procedures, and they've had many different programs, and they've learned how to solve problems, and they've gone through all the A to Z lean tools. Typically, when I walk into a factory that isn't extremely well managed and what you see looks like chaos, and not many plants. There's only a limited number of plants that have the repetition, for example, of a Toyota assembly line. So they may be machining parts that are specialty parts, and they have many different customers, and the customers want variations on the theme of what's being machined, and every day they're getting orders in, and they're trying to make these parts, and they are missing materials that they should have, and the sales is calling in and complaining this customer wants their parts, they're a week late, and then suddenly they'll stop what they're doing and they'll start making the parts for that customer that's complaining, and they don't know what they're doing from hour to hour in the factory. They're just in a completely reactive mode. You could see that if just randomly were to pick factories, pick a region of the country and randomly pick a factory and walk into it and watch what really happens. That's likely what you would see is what I would consider chaos. People just responding and making whatever they want to make, and it's not really what the customer wants. To get to a point where you have a plan and then you're appropriately adapting the plan as you encounter new situations and problems takes a lot of discipline, a lot of planning, and a lot of training. The best builders that I know have long-term relationships with all of their contractors, just like Toyota has long-term relationships with its suppliers. So it takes years before Toyota will trust you enough to supply it parts, and you have to learn Toyota's way to fit into the system. And good builders I know have long-term plumbers and electricians, and they have people that they trust because of quality of their work and because these people work hard and they don't make a lot of mistakes, and they don't end up doing a lot of rework, and they will fit into the schedule, and they'll know how the general contractor works. So if you're building lots of the same, and I know people that do that well with custom homes. If you're in a position where you're making lots of the same unit in some sort of a subdivision, and you're not learning from each unit how to make the next one better, and if your contractors are changing all the time and there's complete variability from like you're starting over each time, then then it's what I would consider a target-rich environment for improvement.
A target-rich environment.
Yeah.
I love that.
There's so many things that you can do to improve. Almost anything you do would improve the situation. And it's real easy. It's just a matter of just picking something and studying it and understanding the process as it is, and then setting some sort of a target and then working toward that target, and you can't help but improve it. And I think what happens is people just get stuck in this firefighting mode, and they're trying to please the customer, and they're trying to reach targets, and they're trying to reach cost targets, and they're trying to deliver on time, and they're just so trapped by firefighting that they can't see beyond that.
Interesting.
And what you want them to do is to stop and look, and it helps if they have somebody external or internal who knows something about process improvement, who's teaching them, because many people don't know how to improve a process. They don't know how to study a process. They don't know they don't know what to measure. They can't figure out what to measure. They don't have the discipline of tracking measures and seeing how we're doing and getting a team together and jointly solving the problem. Just somebody that can teach them how to do that can make a huge positive impact.
So I know from your book that part of the Toyota way is that they have a resource center to teach the subcontractors that they hire, the suppliers, to also use this thing. So there's a top-down kind of like, I'm hiring you, I would like for you to work with my system of kind of lean manufacturing. Is it a two-way street? Can somebody who is maybe a subcontractor implement this and try to make it go up the food chain as well?
Well, it should be two-way in the sense that Toyota's requirements to their suppliers are fairly clear, and Toyota is very good at continuous improvement, at quality, at all these things. And generally, the suppliers, particularly American suppliers, Japanese suppliers, have been working with Toyota for decades, but the American suppliers may be newer to Toyota, So they're usually trying to learn from Toyota, and they would consider it presumptuous to assume they could teach Toyota anything. But some of the problems that you face in manufacturing come from product development, the way something's designed. Parts are not designed to be easy to assemble together or easy to manufacture. So in that sense, Toyota needs to be responsive to the suppliers when the suppliers makes a suggestion. If you were to design it this way, you could use 2 parts instead of 3 parts. We could save you some cost, and you're putting pressure on us to reduce cost. And then Toyota needs a good internal responsive process of taking that to engineering and getting the engineering change made. A lot of suppliers would tell you that most of their automotive customers, you might as well just burn the suggestion as give it to them, because it's not going to go anyplace. But that Toyota and the Japanese companies in general tend to be much more responsive. But that's something that constantly Toyota needs to work on, because they also get busy with product development, new product development. And to change something that's already in the field, it does take some effort. So they constantly have to be kind of pushed to learn. Now, so there are times when the supplier does learn things that Toyota can learn from, and Toyota's culture is that they want to be open to learning from any place. Although, again, they tend to be in a position where they're the teachers rather than the students, so sometimes it's not so easy to put on your student hat when you're a teacher.
So that's interesting. The upstream then would be kind of similar to a subcontractor saying, hey, would you please tell the architect that this needs to be slightly different next time?
Yeah, I built an addition on my house, and I have a really good builder who's exceptional, and I had an architect who designed the structure who the builder never met. And the architect came up with some design concepts that we didn't think were possible. He pushed us beyond our comfort zone. So there are things we wanted, but we said, well, that won't work, and that won't work. And he said, don't worry about what will work. I'll figure it out. So he did some really good things in designing it the way we really wanted. But and it turned out to be, for example, a very intricate roof structure. And when my builder went to build it, he said, this roof structure won't work. I know what he's trying to do, but this can't possibly work. You're going to have leaks. You're going to have you're not going to have good water flow. And he changed the design as he was building, and he did that in a lot of cases where he would then, as he was building, he would just redesign it. And the architecture never knew it. The architect never knew it. And in this case, since we're the sole contractor, the sole customer, our builder could change it as long as we said it was okay. So he didn't have to go get approval from someplace. But we did a lot of work with the Defense Department, and they would have one party who would design a nuclear submarine or a ship or an airplane, and they would get the contract to design it. They would design the whole thing, and then a different company would have to build it. And I remember a shipyard where they had put an engineering office out in the shipyard as they were building a large ship for the Navy. And the only purpose of this engineering office was to approve engineering changes, which they're doing about every hour of every day.
Wow.
They were essentially redesigning the ship as it was being built, and as they discovered all the things that can't work. And the people who had designed it had finished their contract 2 years earlier. And so they were obviously not learning anything. The engineers, the architects were not learning anything. And then the builders had to go through the extra overhead of having somebody approve every change they made. So that's, in terms of quality, that would be called inspecting in quality instead of designing in quality. And the quality was just never designed in and it never will be, because the people who get design contracts aren't the people who build anything, and the people who get the design contracts satisfy the contractual requirements, and nobody ever knows whether it was a good design or not until somebody tries to build it.
So, as far as I understand the generalization, it seems like the Japanese have a kind of edge on this lean process that you described so well in your book. Is the fact that they have a word, kaizen, that describes that entire concept, and we have to kind of explain what that is? If we had a word, would it be easier for us to...
No, I don't think we have lean, and most people don't like the word lean because it sounds like just efficiency and cutting things, and my job's at risk.
So what is it about the Japanese...
No, the Japanese have a culture, and the way I like to explain it, if you look in big picture terms at the Industrial Revolution, we started with craft-based production, and we had small shops of blacksmiths and carpenters and shoemakers, and they were proud craftsmen who were experts at what they did, and they had teachers who taught them, and then there were teachers to apprentices, and you had to learn the craft. And as you learn the craft, you develop relationships in the community for your raw materials, and you're very picky about your raw materials. And then in mass production, everything got centralized in a factory, and we began to build bureaucracies where there are departments for everything. There's a quality department, and there's a safety department, an environmental department, and there's separate architects, and there's separate auditors, and there's separate plumbers. And in the process of creating all these specialty departments, we, for one thing, lost the craft and the passion that goes along with the craft. And for another thing, we broke up the overall problem into so many tiny little specialized pieces that in reality influence each other, that we ended up with all sorts of problems because of lack of coordination and communication. So we broke the organization of pieces that need to coordinate, but they don't coordinate well. And then into what I think of as lean production, and what the Japanese companies that are successful, and there's a lot of not very good Japanese companies, but the ones that we know about that are successful, what happened to them is, the way I put it is, they never lost the craft of their business. They just expanded it to a larger scale. So Toyota, for example, still has a role that doesn't exist in most companies, most manufacturing companies, which is called the chief engineer. And when they develop a new product, like a new Camry or a new Prius, they have one person who's responsible for the design of the vehicle from concept and understanding the customer requirements to actually producing the vehicle. One person. And that person is very powerful and has been trained for 25 years to be a chief engineer. And probably about 1 out of 10 people being trained to be a chief engineer turn out to be a chief engineer. So they have these kind of brilliant people that lead these projects. They have similar people in manufacturing, and they put an enormous amount of effort and time and money into developing every leader at every level, from the plant manager to the team leader and the group leader. And they put a lot of effort into, you mentioned this supplier support. They put a lot of effort into developing their suppliers, which takes years and years and years. And they're constantly going back and checking, but they're in a teaching mode, not just in a mode of confirmation and reports. So they still have a passion about the car, about the engine, about the sound of it, about the feel of it, about the craft of painting it perfectly without defects. And they're continually trying to they want everybody to feel like a craftsman, like they care. If I'm painting the car, I'm painting the car for you as a customer, and I want it to look beautiful and perfect without defects. And they work to instill that in everybody. And if we have to work together, then we're working together for the sake of the customer. And it seems very natural. And they'll do things like make sure that all the people who need to be there to authorize changes to the quality standards or changes to the engineering standards are in the factory localized. So maintenance is not maintenance for a plant. Maintenance is maintenance for the stamping department. And there's other maintenance for the assembly line. And in one plant, one Toyota plant, they called that the home doctor. They want the maintenance person to be like a home doctor who's coming to visit and gets to know you and your family. So they kept a lot of the spirit of the craftsman, even in a mass production environment, where I think we lost that spirit. and everybody's just doing their job.
And do you think we can get it back?
Well, I think the companies that have become serious, not necessarily about lean, but about excellence, about quality, about service excellence and quality in the product, the companies that are serious about it develop a passion at the very top of the company. And if you think about Jim Collins and his great companies, the great companies have a passion at the very senior level, and that passion spreads through the company. So everybody starts to care about the quality. If you're at Four Seasons Hotel and you're working for Four Seasons, or you care about the quality. There is a company in Wisconsin that constructs big buildings, and I just happened to see a presentation where they're talking about the construction of a hospital, and the way they, in the past, would construct a hospital was that they would have an architect, they would design it, they would have a scheduler who would schedule all the individual tasks and give that to the electricians and give the plumbers their schedule and give everybody their schedule, and then they'd be checking to see how people are doing compared to the schedule, project managers, how people are doing compared to the schedule. And they would have tens of thousands of items. They're constantly checking, and they're constantly trying to push people to build things to schedule. And everything would be slipping all the time, and the plumber would get there first, so they would do the plumbing, and the electrician would show up, and there's no place to run the electrical wires because the plumbing is away. And this was just constant trouble. And they were always overrunning cost and time for the building. So they got a new CEO who had come out of the auto industry, as it turned out, and he was a believer in lean. And he said, I'd like you to build this building in 40% less time than you've ever built it before. And they said, okay. And he gave them some ideas for how to do it. And they started to just completely rethink the building. And they had been doing what they call lean construction for years. And they had used something called Last Planner, which is a tool for lean planning of a building. And they had daily plans, and they had visual rooms where they had all these Post-it notes on the rooms. And so they thought they were doing lean pretty well, but to reach this 40% goal, they had to really rethink how they did things. And the breakthrough was, they said, we're really not building a building, we're building a lot of rooms. And let's count and they were building the exterior of the building at this time. They said, let's count the number of rooms, and we're building the outside of the room, including in the outside of the building was the plumbing and the electrical and the heating and ventilation systems. Those were all built into the walls. They said, let's count the number of rooms, and we'll number them. So this room is 1, this is 2, and this is 3, and this is 4. And let's figure out how many rooms we have to build. And then we know how much time we have, and let's figure out how often a room needs to get done. And they figured out, for example, that they need to finish 3 rooms in 4 days. So then they scheduled the 3 rooms in 4 days. Then for each of these rooms, they said, let's get a team of a cross-trade team, and they'll know that they have 4 days to finish this room. And they need to develop a plan in 4 days for how they're going to finish it. Again, it's the exterior, but how they're going to finish it. And then, as they were going through this exercise, they would discover obstacles. Like one of the obstacles was, we have a cross-trades team. Each of them has something to do, but they can't do it all at once. You can't be putting plumbing in and HVAC and electrical at the same time. So now I'm going to have a plumber who's plumbing while everybody else stands around watching the plumber. So the solution to that was to have cross-training, and that violated the union agreement, that only a plumber can do plumbing. So they had talked to the union and asked, would it be okay if other people are helping the plumber, as long as we have a qualified plumber there and the plumber is directing the work? Would it be okay if other people help the plumber? And they managed to negotiate that with the union and come up with an agreement, and that happened. So when they set it up this way with cross-functional teams that knew what their targets were, not I need to do these 100 things over the next 8 months, and these are the 5 things I'm supposed to do today, but we need to get this room done in 3 days, and we know how many hours there are, so they could sort of count down hour by hour how we're doing compared to meeting our target. Then the teams became very creative, and they also became very motivated. And they had quality standards that they had to meet, but if they had a problem, they were instructed immediately call for help. And they just simply use a walkie-talkie. And since they knew this is where I'm supposed to be, it's now 2 o'clock on Monday, this is where I'm supposed to be, and I'm half an hour behind, they would call for help. And then somebody would come and help them. And anyway, they ended up getting the building done ahead of schedule, ahead of this aggressive schedule of lesson. And they met all their other targets for cost and quality. And they never had to plan in detail every single wire and every single piece of plumbing. So it was a different way of thinking about the construction process. We did similar work in overhaul and repair of nuclear submarines, and they did a similar thing where they broke the submarine into chunks, into pieces. And then they figured out how often that piece needed to be done in order to complete the submarine within a time period. And they had empowered teams, and then they started thinking, if we want the team to do the work in this number of days, they can't afford to get off and on the submarine to get all their own materials. So we need to bring the materials to them as they need the materials. And they knew what materials they needed that day exactly. And they had to move to improve the materials delivery process, which they worked on. And it all worked out, but it was all driven by the need and the clear target of, I'm going to finish this today. And I know what I need to finish, and I know why.
Jeff, it has been fascinating talking with you about all this, and I hope that we can continue the conversation on another episode. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
You're welcome.
Jeff Lacker is a professor of industrial and operational engineering at University of Michigan, and he's the author of The Toyota Way and the Principle of Lacker Lean Advisors. You have been listening to a special episode of the Building Performance Podcast. I'm Corbett Lunsford. Tune in next time.
A rising tide lifts all boats. Fall Fast Track.